So they're pretty crazy numbers, and that led me to wonder how well it was going to perform, if it was going to be a bit of a hiss monster with different devices. All sorts of questions came to mind because I've never seen an IEM with quite these specifications. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Today we're taking a look at the HarmonicDyne Devil IEM. This is another IEM that's been sent out courtesy of channel sponsor Linsol, so I want to start by saying a huge thanks to them. And then let me introduce the Devil by saying that it's a dual dynamic $199 IEM with a pretty insane set of specs where it's got just a 5 ohm impedance and a 123 decibel sensitivity. So they're pretty crazy numbers, and that led me to wonder how well it was going to perform, if it was going to be a bit of a hiss monster with different devices. All sorts of questions came to mind because I've never seen an IEM with quite these specifications. Like most IEMs you're going to buy these days, things are pretty straightforward when it comes to accessories and inclusions in the box with the HarmonicDyne Devil. And that is to say that you're going to get a carry case, a cable and some tips. And in each case, I'd say that everything's pretty solid. In particular, I very much like the cable that comes with the Devil. It's a nice fabric. It's got a nice fabric sleeve on it. It feels very lovely, very premium. The tips are fine. They're nothing special, but they're fine. And the case likewise is just your generic kind of case. And so where things deviate more is in the actual design of the Devils themselves. As I've already said, specifications-wise, they're very unique with that 5 ohm impedance. That's insanely low. But there's also some uniqueness in the physical design of the IEM as well. And what I mean by that is that we've got a very unique and I think very stylish looking shell design. It's got this interesting raised section out the front of it that's actually got some venting going on in there. It looks pretty cool, I think, when you look up close. But more importantly, there's a really interesting nozzle design on these. At first glance, there's like a couple of ridges in the nozzle, and it made me think that maybe it was designed for the different tips to go on at 2 different stages, somewhat like what the Sennheisers can do. But as I played around with it more and more, most tips didn't want to go past the first ridge, and that was largely because if you went any further, if you could even make it go further, the actual tip of the nozzle was going to start sticking through the tip and potentially scratch inside your ear. So I don't know what that design of the nozzle is for. I've played around with it a bit and I can't find a way that makes it work to give you 2 different levels of tip depth, if you like, and insertion depth as a result. And then on the other hand, what it's doing is it's meaning they've got quite a long nozzle. And that could be great for some people who have larger, longer ear canals. But for those like me, it can make them just a little bit tricky to get them inserted. They're not uncomfortable or bad in any way, shape or form, but they're not the most comfortable IEMs I've tried. A bit of playing around with ear tips and I was fine, but I did want to flag it. For those of you like me with somewhat troublesome ears, these could be a bit tricky, but I also wouldn't say to completely avoid them. They're not an uncomfortable IEM overall. Having said that, it does lead to one issue, which I've already alluded to, and that is that you are definitely going to need to play around with them to get the right level of fit. These are an IEM, I think, because of that long nozzle, that really need a great fit to sound their best. When I was playing around with different ear tips and also playing around with the measurements, what I found was that depending on how well I got the seal and the depth of insertion in my ear, how well I did that completely changed how they sounded. In some cases, they could be really trebly, really bright. Whereas when I got the right fit, and for me that was with the Final Audio E-type tips, once I got those tips onto the Devils, they sounded wonderful for me. Now that could be partly due to the closed-in bore, the bore being the hole through the middle of the tip, but then it could have also been that the Final E-type tips allowed me to get a better insertion depth and better seal within the ear canal. So do take that into account. If you get yourself a pair of these, I'm about to explain what they sound like, but take that into account as being with the right level of seal, at least the right level for me. So if you do happen to get yourself a pair of these and they sound completely different, give them a bit of a chance, play around with tips a little bit before you make up your mind. It is possible that your ears might just have different sensitivities, different resonances to mine. That's a thing. I covered it off in a video a little while ago called Why All IEM Reviews Are Wrong. But in addition to that, this is one of those IEMs that just within itself can vastly vary depending on fit. So take that into account, play with the ear tips, play with the insertion depth, don't hurt yourself in the process, but don't make up your mind until you've played around with some different tips. And so now let me jump in and tell you what I think you can expect to hear once you get those tips and the insertion depth for you correct. If you're trying to work out what piece of gear you should buy next, then the Passion for Sounds Recommends database might be helpful for you. In the description box of every single video, just down here, you'll find the Passion for Sounds Recommends section. If you click on this link, it'll take you through to the Passion for Sounds Recommends Airtable database. What you'll see in here is every single product that I've ever reviewed and recommend, in some cases products that I own but maybe haven't reviewed but recommend. And then once you're in here, you can use the filter button up here to decide to filter by things like whether or not the product type is for a headphone, for example. So maybe you're looking for a headphone. Filter it by that and you can now see every headphone I recommend. You can sort it by price, which is the default sorting, or any other sorting method that you want. And then once you've got the list of products you're looking for, you've got the links to the reviews of the products, and then also purchasing links for global retailers and also regional retailers for the US, Australia, Canada, and the UK. So feel free to play around with this, sort it, filter it however you want to. It won't affect what anybody else sees, and you can hopefully find just the right products for you. I hope this is helpful, and now let's get back to the review. I'm going to start off by showing you the graph for the Devils straight away, and the reason I'm going to do that is because I want to start off by talking about the treble. The treble on these, when you look at the graph, looks like it's wildly overbalanced. But in reality, and again this comes back to all of that insertion depth stuff I spoke about before, in reality, I think the treble from the Devils is really well controlled. There's no doubt that there is a treble emphasis from these. They are a treble-oriented headphone with a leaning towards brightness and sort of, not sterility, but a clean, crisp sound. But it's very, very well controlled, and that's quite impressive to me. Often when I see graphs like this, the treble can get harsh and get sibilant, but I didn't find that from the Devils as long as the insertion was correct. What that also translates to is a fantastic sense of clarity and articulation through the sound. And these give a wonderful sense of kind of a delicate, tactile sort of feel to the treble, the leading edges of notes. They're very enjoyable in that sense. Moving into the mid-range, things are very focused and clean. It's also supported by that treble that I just spoke about before, helping to define the edges of sounds. But something that really stood out to me straight away was that the imaging from the mid-range is kind of right in where the third eye would be. I'll talk more about staging in a moment, but it really struck me just how much they focus the image of, say, a vocal or a lead instrumental right there in the top of the forehead, right in the center. As you'd expect from an earphone, with a little bit of sort of treble emphasis, they can get a little bit sibilant sometimes, or more to the point, sibilant sounds in the recordings can bite occasionally. They can have quite a lot of energy to them. I wouldn't describe them specifically as a sibilant headphone, but a treble-oriented headphone that therefore is going to show you when there's sibilance in the recording, and it's not going to show you in a gentle way either. And so just to clarify what I mean there, they're not going to make every recording sound sibilant and harsh, but they're definitely going to show you and probably sort of slightly emphasize when a recording isn't great. I think for their tuning, their bass qualities are actually very good. The bass registers take a sort of second seat behind the mid-range and the treble for sure, particularly the treble. But when you do hear the bass, when the bass is there in the mix, it actually comes across really nicely. They've got a good sense of extension, a decent sense of presence, and like I said, it's not that the bass is lacking so much as that the treble is emphasized. When you do need a rumble that goes all the way down to the bottom of the registers, the Devils absolutely have that. They've got excellent extension despite being a treble-focused earphone. And whilst I think that overall they lean towards a sort of cooler than neutral, more treble-oriented than neutral sound, I think their tonality is pretty good. They don't sound unnatural, they don't sound way off in any area. The treble response seems pretty smooth from a perceptual point of view. It seems pretty smooth throughout the range, but they definitely tilt towards that treble end. So if you like a brighter, leaner sound, the Devils could be really interesting for you. And I think most importantly, the thing I'm impressed with them is that they haven't lost all sense of warmth. There have been some other IEMs that I've tried over the years. I think from memory, one that jumps to mind is something like the Super Spaceship Reference, I think it was called. That earphone for me was very treble oriented, did treble really well, but had a lack of bass and depth, and therefore lack of warmth and presence. Whereas I think with the Devils, they've given you that same sense of treble emphasis, treble detail, treble clarity, but still with a sense of body and warmth just kind of sitting underneath to give everything a foundation. So that's really positive. Moving into some of the more technical presentation pieces of the Devil, the soundstage is quite spacious for an IEM, and at this price point, it's not a huge soundstage, but the sense of space between sounds gives it a good sense of kind of not being congested. In particular, I think the width is very strong from the Devils, but they don't quite manage to give you the sphericality of a really natural soundstage. They're a slightly triangular sound, meaning that the sounds go from kind of level or just beyond the ears, forwards into the forehead, but it's kind of in a flat line. The best of the best IEMs and headphones that I've tried give you a sense of a roundness to the soundstage, which is a bit more natural in terms of how sound spreads out. And so they're not perfect in that regard, but they're definitely not bad. They've got a good, solid presentation of sound for the price point we're talking about. And then finally, when we're talking about the focus of the image, I think the Devils are excellent, particularly on the sides and in the center. It's interesting that when you do start to have sounds appearing at those kind of 45-degree lines, that's where I find the Devils maybe just lose a little bit of focus somehow in the image. And that's a bit of a weird thing because they're delivering the same sound across the board. It's just something about their tuning and tonality is somehow affecting the perception of sounds, comparing the left-right sounds, the center sounds, and those diagonal sounds. And I'm guessing that's got something to do with the way the different frequencies would reflect naturally within the soundstage, what would be more or less enhanced at those 45-degree marks. But I'm really just nitpicking here. Ultimately, what I'd say is that the soundstage, the imaging, the focus from the Devils, for the price you're paying, is really excellent. It's just a very interesting presentation, and not interesting in a good or a bad way, just a bit different. And so at this point, in isolation, I'd say the Devils are a really good sounding IEM. It is worth noting that if you're into classical music, they've got a lovely sense of texture and detail and clarity, but they might lack the sense of depth and body and drama that you might want, depending on your preferences. And likewise, that carries over to things where you need a bit more rhythm and drive. So rock, blues, hip-hop, R&B, all those sorts of genres, they might leave you a little bit wanting there, depending on your taste in terms of the bass presence. But I think if you're a fan of treble-oriented headphones, leaner, cooler, crisper-sounding IEMs, then I think that's where the Devils could be really strong. I personally would like a little bit more tonal balance between the bass and the mids, but I think for the tuning they're offering it really well. And so then the question came up for me, what else is around this $199 mark that might compete as well, better, or just differently depending on your tastes? The first IEM I reached for was the iKKO OH10. This has been a favourite of mine for quite a long time. It's recently been bumped off its perch a little bit by a couple of other earphones we'll talk about shortly. But reaching for the iKKO OH10 to see how it compares with the Devil, and what I heard were two very different IEMs. The iKKO has got this really thumpy, thunderous bass when it wants to. It's also got a lot of treble emphasis, much like the Devil. But they're very different IEMs where you've got one being the Devil that's a bit more delicate, it's a bit lighter in its touch, whereas the OH10 is kind of bombastic, it's got this big, big bass and big, big treble to produce this incredibly fun sound. On a track like Robbed Blind by Keith Richards, the OH10 starts off with the bass guitar just sounding so solid and full, there's a sense of almost punch coming from the bass. Moving into the guitars and the vocals, they've both got richness and texture as well. So again, this is where we start to get the body of the sort of the foundation of the notes, as well as the texture coming from the treble over the top. The Devils did still sound good on this track, but what I found was that they started to overemphasize some things. Sounds like rim shots and cymbal hits just started to get a little bit too present in the mix. And I also found that the vocal got a little bit sibilant from the Devils. And this is where again that the OH10 and the Devils both have enhanced treble, but by the OH10s having that extra bass, and they've got significantly extra bass, by having that, the bass helps to balance the treble and give you a better overall sort of sense of smoothness and overall balanced tonality. Neither of them I would consider to be neutral or natural sounding IEMs, but I think the overall tuning of the Devils just throws it off a little bit and makes certain sounds a bit unnatural, like those cymbals and rim shots. And then obviously the sibilance as well can get in the way too. And so for me, I don't know that I'd choose the Devils over the OH10, but at the same time, the OH10 isn't perfect either, so it's going to be a little bit of a trade-off. Luckily for us, there are more IEMs on the market to choose from at this price point, and the next one I reached for was the Moondrop KATO. still listening to Robbed Blind by Keith Richards, and the Kato immediately reminded me why it's one of my favourites in this price level, and that's because it is just so neutral. It's got such a neutrally tuned sound, it just delivers everything as it is in the recording. And so everything's better balanced between bass, mids and treble, but still very, very clean. And while the bass doesn't have quite the presence that it did on the OH10, the vocals and the mid-range, everything else just blends together so beautifully. And indeed what listening to the Katos reminds me of is a really nice pair of studio monitors. Very neutral, very clean, very honest. And the result of that is an excellent sense of soundstage and presentation because everything's in the mix exactly where it should be. And so in that regard, I think the Katos just do a better job across the board than the Devils. Unless you are looking specifically for that treble-oriented sound with that enhanced sense of detail and clarity that comes with it, I think the Katos are the better choice. Which is not to say the Devils are bad, they're just a very specific tuning for a very specific taste. And so I could have wrapped things up there, but I thought I'd throw one more in the mix, and that's my current absolute favourite at this price point, and it's the THIEAUDIO Elixir. The Elixirs really caught my attention when I first listened to them because they've got a wonderful sense of kind of tactility, articulation, whatever you want to call it. You can almost feel the leading edge of notes when you listen to the Elixirs. And so I was curious to see the Devils with their treble tuning give you a nice sense of that clarity and that energy in sounds. And I was curious to see if they could outdo the Elixirs in that sense, or if the Elixirs could actually provide the same level of excitement whilst also having more depth in the bass, which I already knew they did. The question was, did the Elixirs balance everything better overall, or was there a strength towards the Devils? Firing Up Temple by Kings of Leon, I tried out both. And the Devils actually surprised me with the amount of kick-bass punch they delivered on this track. And this is the thing with the Devils, as I said before, they've got that treble emphasis, but they've also got the foundation kind of hiding behind the scenes. So they're not by any means a completely lacking IEM. I definitely do like them. But as I continued to listen, there was a little bit too much emphasis on the snare and the hi-hat. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't natural. Once again, something they do very well was they focus the vocals very well. But then the moment I moved across to the Elixirs, everything was just more engaging. There was even more punch on that kick drum from the Elixirs, not boosted or enhanced, just what I would consider a more natural presentation. And the Elixirs was still very clean, and they did have that wonderful sense of energy and articulation to the sound. And so that's really where, for me, these two can be separated, is that the Devils give you that articulation and clarity, but that's pretty much the focus of them. They don't balance it very well with everything else. Whereas when you move over to something like the Elixirs, you're getting that articulation and clarity as well as depth and body and punch in the bass. And so for me, after going through this little comparison, what I would say is that I think the Devils are a lovely IEM. As I said before, if you're looking for a treble-oriented sound, I think they're an excellent tuning with that kind of emphasis. Having said that, if you're looking for pure neutrality, if you're looking for an honest, accurate representation of the music at about this $200 price point, then the Katos are almost unbeatable. And at the same time, if you're looking for a more what I would call musical presentation that's got a bit of tasteful coloration to it, but is still very honest and very natural sounding, then that's where I think the Elixirs are pretty much unbeatable. If I had all four of these on my desk, I personally would reach for the Elixirs first, probably the Katos second, and then it's going to be a toss-up between the OH10 and the Devils. I love the OH10 for their massive soundstage and their sense of bass presence and thump and rumble, but at the same time, I can really appreciate the Devils for that sense of clarity and sort of focus in the treble. And so if you're in the market for IEMs and you're looking at the Devils, do make sure you check out the Elixirs and the Katos as well, depending on where your preferences lie. Don't discount the Devils completely, but I do think they sit a clear third place or maybe sort of second behind those two equal firsts. And so as always, I hope this video has been useful and helpful to you. If it has, I'd love it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.